He was the monster of the north, a sovereign who bathed his claws in the blood of traitors. No one dared meet his gaze, until a lowly maid tripped on the frozen cobblestones, and the most feared man alive dropped to his knees just to tie her worn laces. The winter of 1482 did not merely arrive in the kingdom of Ethelgard, it descended like a heavy iron shroud. The cobblestones of the high courtyard were permanently slick with frost, and the gargoyles perched atop the castle spires seemed to shiver beneath their coats of snow. Within the fortified stone walls ruled King Darien, a monarch whose reputation was as merciless as the biting winds outside. They called him the Lycan King. It was a title born of whispers, of the feral gleam in his amber eyes, and of the brutal, animalistic savagery with which he tore through his enemies on the battlefield. Rumors insisted that beneath his velvet doublets and heavy furs he was more beast than man, cursed by the old gods to transform into a towering nightmare of fur and fangs when the moon hung full and heavy in the night sky. In his presence, lords trembled. Battle-hardened knights cast their eyes to the floor. To look King Darien in the eye was to invite death. He ruled through absolute terror, a solitary figure seated upon a throne forged from the melted swords of those who had foolishly challenged his reign. Yet, in the sprawling, soot-stained kitchens far below the grand halls, terror was a luxury the servants could ill afford. Here, survival was dictated by the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the scorching heat of the massive hearths, and the endless scrubbing of copper pots. Among the soot and steam moved Evelyn. She was not a princess in disguise, nor a lady stripped of her title. Evelyn was simply a scullery maid, born to the dirt and destined to remain there. Her hands were calloused, her ash-blonde hair constantly tucked away beneath a rough linen cap, and her only possessions of value were a pair of sturdy, second-hand leather boots gifted to her by a dying mother. The laces were frayed, knotted together in several places to keep them functional, a physical testament to a life held together by mere threads. The turning point of their lives, and the genesis of a legend that would eventually bleed out of folklore and into the stark, unforgiving pages of real history, occurred during the feast of the winter solstice. The Great Hall was a suffocating display of wealth and gluttony. Hundreds of nobles sat at the long oak tables, dripping in jewels and swathed in imported silks, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. At the head of the room sat King Darien. He did not feast. He sat in brooding silence, a chalice of dark wine resting untouched in his massive, scarred hand. The room's chaotic energy always seemed to die a swift death whenever his amber eyes swept over the crowd. Evelyn had been conscripted to serve the high table, a task usually reserved for the most senior servants. She carried a massive silver platter laden with roasted fowl, her arms trembling under the sheer weight of it. As she approached the dais where the Lycan King sat, the air around him felt physically heavier, charged with a predatory static that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. She kept her eyes firmly planted on the floor, focusing entirely on placing one foot in front of the other. Step, breathe, step, breathe. But fate is a cruel architect. As Evelyn stepped up onto the stone dais, the weakened, knotted lace of her right boot finally gave way. It snapped with a quiet pop that felt as loud as a cannon blast in her ears. The sudden loss of tension sent the boot sliding off her heel. Evelyn stumbled. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. The massive silver platter tipped forward. Roasted fowl, greasy potatoes, and rivers of heavy dark gravy slid off the silver surface, crashing onto the pristine white fur rug that lay directly at King Darien's feet. A heavy goblet of wine was knocked over in the chaos, sending a tide of crimson splashing directly onto the king's black leather boots. Evelyn collapsed onto her knees, the sharp stone bruising her bones. A deafening, suffocating silence instantly fell over the great hall. The music stopped, the jesters froze. Even the crackling of the massive hearths seemed to mute itself. Hundreds of eyes turned to the dais, wide with morbid anticipation. The punishment for spilling a drop of wine on a nobleman was a whipping. The punishment for defiling the Lycan King was execution. Evelyn's breath hitched in her throat. She closed her eyes, her entire body trembling like a leaf in a tempest. She waited for the roar. She waited for the heavy strike of a broadsword or the tearing of claws. Instead, she heard the slow, deliberate scrape of a heavy wooden chair being pushed back. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stone. The king was approaching. Evelyn kept her eyes glued to the floor, her vision blurring with terrified tears. She saw the tips of his wine-stained boots come into view. Then, the impossible happened. The Lycan King, the monster who commanded armies and slaughtered without mercy, lowered his massive frame. He did not draw a weapon. He knelt. The collective gasp that rippled through the great hall was palpable. Nobles half stood from their chairs, their faces pale with shock. Evelyn flinched, expecting a blow, but then she felt large, calloused hands known only for breaking necks and wielding broadswords gently brush against her ankle. She slowly, daringly lifted her gaze. Darian was looking directly at her. Up close, his eyes were not the demonic fires the rumors claimed, but a deep, mesmerizing shade of amber, swirling with an unspoken intensity. The brutal scars that slashed across his jawline only highlighted the sudden, shocking tenderness in his expression. He reached down, taking the two snapped ends of her frayed leather lace. With surprising dexterity, his massive, deadly fingers worked the coarse leather, threading it back through the eyelets of her cheap boot and pulling it taut, tying a firm, secure knot. "A poor foundation invites a fatal fall, little bird," Darian murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated entirely for her ears alone. He stood up, towering over her once more. He did not look at the spilled food or the ruined rug. He simply turned his terrifying gaze upon the stunned nobles in the hall. "The feast continues," he commanded, his voice returning to its usual cold, commanding bark. "Anyone who stares for another second will lose their eyes." The hall immediately erupted back into a frantic, forced cacophony of feasting and music. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her mind reeling, her heart hammering against her ribs. She fled back to the kitchens, the ghost of the king's touch burning like a brand against her ankle. She did not know it then, but that single, solitary act of kneeling had irrevocably sealed both of their fates, setting into motion a chain of events that would shatter the kingdom and invoke a karma so devastating it would echo into reality. The tale of the Lycan King kneeling for a scullery maid spread through the castle faster than a plague. It was whispered in the corridors, debated in the armories, and hissed maliciously behind velvet fans in the ladies' chambers. To the common folk, it was a spark of hope, a sign that the beast had a heart. But to the nobility, it was an insult. It was a dangerous display of weakness. No one was more infuriated by this event than Lady Catherine of House Vance. No, House Valerius. Lady Catherine was an aristocrat of the highest order, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her boundless ambition. For years, she had been groomed to become Darian's queen. She had endured his coldness, his terrifying moods, and the suffocating atmosphere of his court, all for the promise of the crown. To see the man who refused to even kiss her hand drop to his knees for a dirt-smudged servant was an indignity she could not swallow. Lady Catherine did not act with blind rage. She acted with calculated malice. She allied herself with Lord Reginald, the king's chancellor, a man who despised Darian's iron-fisted rule and secretly sought to undermine his authority. Together, they watched. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic between Darian and Evelyn shifted in quiet, unseen ways. Darian, drawn to the only person in his castle who did not look at him with thinly veiled terror, began to seek her out. He would find her in the gardens picking frost-bitten herbs or in the library dusting the high shelves. They rarely spoke. It was a romance born of silent acknowledgments, a lingering gaze, a small, rare smile from the king, a basket of fresh bread left mysteriously in Evelyn's humble quarters. For Evelyn, the terrifying monarch had dissolved, revealing a profoundly lonely man trapped by his own monstrous reputation. She began to fall in love with the man beneath the crown, but the eyes of the court were always watching. Catherine and Reginald formulated a plot so insidious it would force Darian's hand. They knew they could not attack Evelyn directly. Darian's wrath would be absolute. Instead, they needed to make Evelyn a threat to the kingdom itself. The trap was sprung on the eve of the blood moon. It was the one night of the month when the Lycan curse was said to be at its strongest, a night when Darien locked himself in the deepest dungeons to protect the castle from his own feral instincts. That morning, the captain of the guard burst into the king's chambers. He carried a small velvet-wrapped bundle. Inside was a silver dagger, its blade coated in a thick, sticky paste of wolfsbane and nightshade, the only known poisons capable of weakening a Lycan. The dagger had been found hidden beneath the mattress in Evelyn's quarters. Furthermore, Lord Reginald produced forged letters, meticulously crafted to look like Evelyn's handwriting, detailing a plot to assassinate the king on behalf of a rival southern kingdom. Darien summoned Evelyn to the throne room. The hall was packed with nobles, their faces masks of grim satisfaction. When Evelyn was dragged in by two heavily armored guards, her confusion was absolute. Darien sat upon his throne, his face an unreadable mask of stone. But Evelyn saw the microscopic tremor in his jaw. She saw the war raging in his amber eyes. "Evelyn of the lower kitchens," Lord Reginald announced, his voice echoing loudly. "You are charged with high treason, attempted regicide, and consorting with the enemies of Ethelgard. The penalty is death by the pyre. What say you?" Evelyn stared at Darien. "I did nothing," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My lord, you know me. You know I would never." Darien looked at the silver dagger resting on the table. He looked at the forged letters. He knew, with every instinct in his body, that it was a lie. He could smell the deceit on Lord Reginald and Lady Catherine. He knew Evelyn was innocent. But Darien was a king first, and a man second. He looked out at the sea of nobles, the very people he needed to keep his fractured kingdom from falling into civil war. If he pardoned a servant caught with assassination tools, he would look weak. His enemies would strike. The fear that kept his kingdom together would shatter. In that agonizing moment, the Lycan King, the fearless monster of the north, made the most cowardly decision of his life. He chose his crown over his soul. Darien stood up. The hall held its breath. He did not look into Evelyn's eyes. "The evidence is clear," Darien said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It sounded like grinding stones. "However, in recognition of her past service, the sentence of the pyre is commuted. She is banished to the frost wastes. Let the winter claim her." A collective gasp swept through the room. The frost wastes was a death sentence, just a slower, crueler one. Evelyn let out a broken sob, the betrayal hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The man who had knelt to tie her shoe, the man who had looked at her with such hidden tenderness, had just discarded her to maintain his political power. As the guards dragged her away, Evelyn finally found her voice. She did not scream for mercy. She looked back over her shoulder, her tear-stained eyes locking onto Darien's. "You are not a king!" she yelled, her voice ringing out with a strange, prophetic clarity. "You are just a coward hiding behind teeth and steel. And for this betrayal, Darien, you will lose everything. The crown you chose over me will turn to ash on your head. This I swear." Her words hung in the air long after she was dragged from the hall, a chilling curse that Darien would dismiss in his arrogance, unaware of the devastating, inescapable karma he had just unleashed upon himself. Evelyn was cast out the very next morning. Stripped of her warm cloak, she was forced through the heavy iron gates of Ethelgard, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the frayed leather boots upon her feet. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her, the boom echoing like the final beat of a dying heart. She walked into the howling blizzard of the frost wastes, and history, or so the bards claimed, lost sight of her. The legend simply stated that the winter swallowed her whole. But karma is not a myth, nor is it a fairy tale confined to the dusty pages of medieval fantasy. Karma is the ruthless, unyielding law of consequence. It is here that the romanticized folklore of the Lycan King abruptly ends, and the grim, documented reality of history takes over. You see, the story of Darien and Evelyn was not merely a campfire tale whispered to frighten children. It was a romanticized allegory for a very real, very brutal historical betrayal that occurred in the late 15th century. A betrayal that triggered a downfall so spectacular it was recorded in the private diaries of later scholars. The Lycan curse was not magic. as documented centuries later in the sealed medical journals of Dr. Thomas Sydenham, and corroborated by the private letters of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. The Beast of the North was actually a man suffering from severe clinical lycanthropy and advanced porphyria conditions that made him hypersensitive to sunlight, caused his gums to recede, giving him a fanged appearance, and induced terrifying bouts of psychosis. The magic of his reign was nothing more than systemic fear and medical ignorance. When Darian banished the only woman who had anchored his fragile sanity, the psychological dam broke. The karma that Evelyn had promised did not arrive in the form of a magical lightning bolt. It arrived through the brutal, inescapable consequences of his own actions. Without Evelyn's quiet, grounding presence, Darian's paranoia consumed him. He began to see traitors in every shadow. Within a month of her banishment, he ordered the execution of Lord Reginald and Lady Catherine, having finally realized their treachery, but it was too late. The execution sparked an outrage among the nobility. The very political stability he had sacrificed Evelyn to protect instantly collapsed. The real-world karma hit back with terrifying precision. The winter of 1483 was the harshest recorded in European history. Trade routes froze. Crops died in the ground. The people of Ethelgard, already weary of Darian's erratic, bloody rule, began to starve. When the people starve, they do not fear kings. They eat them. Rebellions erupted in the southern provinces. Darian's once loyal army, unpaid and freezing, began to desert in droves. The king locked himself inside his fortress, his physical health rapidly deteriorating as the porphyria ravaged his body. He became a prisoner in his own home, pacing the cold stone floors, howling at the moon not out of a magical curse, but out of profound, agonizing madness. Historical records, specifically the surviving tax ledgers of the neighboring Duchy of Westmoreland, show that within 3 years, Darian's kingdom was entirely bankrupt. His castles were besieged, breached, and looted. When the rebel forces finally stormed the inner sanctum of Ethelgard, they expected a brutal fight against the legendary monster. Instead, they found a broken, emaciated man huddled in the corner of the Great Hall, clutching a single, frayed leather shoelace. Darian was not executed. In a twist of poetic, cruel karma, the rebel leaders deemed him too pathetic to kill. They stripped him of his titles, his wealth, and his lands. They threw him out of the very same iron gates he had forced Evelyn through years prior. The feared Lycan King spent the final years of his life as a nameless beggar wandering the muddy, frozen roads of the territories he once ruled. He became the very thing he had discarded. He experienced the exact helplessness, the exact freezing cold, and the exact agonizing destitution that he had inflicted upon an innocent girl. He died anonymously in a ditch, his body unclaimed, unmourned, and completely forgotten by the very nobles he had ruined his soul to impress. The karma was absolute. It was real. It was documented, and it stripped away the fantasy to reveal the harsh truth. No amount of power, no crown, and no fearsome reputation can protect a man from the consequences of a hollow, cowardly heart. While the official, state-sanctioned chronicles of Ethelgard deliberately erased Evelyn from existence, the bitter winds of the frost wastes refused to claim her. The universe, it seems, has a profound aversion to unbalanced scales. Where King Darian's karma was a spectacular, crumbling descent into madness and ruin, Evelyn's karma was the arduous, agonizing, and heavily documented climb toward an unprecedented redemption. When the heavy iron gates slammed shut behind her, Evelyn was thrust into a merciless white oblivion. The cold was not merely a temperature. It was a physical predator that bit through her thin linen dress and gnawed violently at her bones. She walked for 2 days and 2 nights, surviving only on handfuls of snow and the stubborn, blazing fury of a woman unjustly condemned. Her frayed leather boots, the very boots the terrifying Lycan King had knelt to tie, became heavily waterlogged and froze solid to her feet. Frostbite turned her skin, a mottled, necrotic black, and exhaustion painted dark, hallucinatory shadows across the blinding white tundra. She was found entirely by chance, half buried in a towering snowdrift, by a heavily armed, traveling caravan of spice merchants. These men belonged to the real-world Hanseatic League, a powerful, highly organized commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds that completely dominated maritime trade in Northern Europe during the late Middle Ages. The caravan's leader, a gruff, heavily scarred but inherently pragmatic trader named Johannes Holbein, ordered his men to dig her out. He initially assumed she was a frozen corpse to be looted for copper or cloth. Instead, beneath the ice, he found a faint, stubborn pulse. In a private wax-sealed merchant log later discovered in the archives of Lübeck, Holbein documented the exact moment of her rescue. "We pulled a girl from the ice today, no older than 20. Her clothes were rags of Ethelgard make, her lips blue as bruised plums. I told the men to leave her, that the breath would leave her lungs before nightfall. But when my quartermaster reached to take her frozen boots, her eyes snapped open. She did not weep. She did not beg for a fire. She simply looked at me with eyes like hardened flint and demanded to know which way was south. I have never seen a ghost so angry." Evelyn was transported in the back of a grain wagon to the bustling, fiercely independent trading hub of Lübeck. She did not awaken as a broken, weeping girl mourning a lost royal romance. The absolute, soul-crushing betrayal at the hands of King Darien had burned away every ounce of her naivety, leaving behind nothing but forged steel. Her physical recovery was brutal. Treated by the city's leading physician, Dr. Wilhelm Kessler, she paid the ultimate toll to the winter, losing 3 toes on her left foot to the black rot of frostbite. Yet, when she finally stood upright, learning to walk with a slight, permanent limp, she refused to be a beggar on the harbor streets. This is where the fairy tale definitively shatters and the remarkable documented reality of Evelyn's rise begins. She began working as a lowly mortar and pestle grinder in Kessler's apothecary. It was here that she utilized the extensive, intimate knowledge of wild herbs, roots, and fungi she had acquired while foraging in the freezing, neglected gardens of Ethelgard. Evelyn realized early on that the very flora used to frame her for high treason possessed incredible, undocumented medical properties. She began secretly experimenting after hours, eventually introducing a line of revolutionary treatments that fundamentally changed maritime medicine in the Baltic region. The nightshade dilution. Using microdoses of the deadly nightshade plant, she created an effective antispasmodic tincture that cured the severe stomach cramping and seasickness that routinely decimated merchant crews. The wolfsbane poultice. Carefully neutralizing the toxic alkaloids of wolfsbane, she developed a powerful topical analgesic that immediately relieved the agonizing joint inflammation suffered by aging harbor workers and dockhands. The willow bark elixir, a concentrated brew that acted as an early, highly potent fever reducer, saving hundreds of lives during the harsh coastal winters. Evelyn patented her tinctures under the strict protection of the Guild of St. Jude, but she did not stop at medicine. She possessed an insatiable, terrifying hunger to secure her own foundation so that no king, lord, or man could ever pull the rug from beneath her again. She learned to read complex merchant ledgers. She mastered the harsh, unforgiving mathematics of international trade, currency exchange, and maritime taxation. Within a decade, the lowly, dirt-smudged scullery maid who had been banished to die in the snow was sitting at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table in the guild hall. She was no longer Evelyn of the lower kitchens. She was Evelyn the Northern Healer, a woman negotiating lucrative trade routes with the wealthiest lords of the Baltic Sea. The contrast between her life and Darien's was the ultimate, inescapable manifestation of cosmic justice. As Darien's blinding paranoia caused him to lock himself in his dark, decaying castle, violently alienating his allies and bleeding his treasury entirely dry, Evelyn was building powerful alliances, funding expansive orphanages, and accumulating a personal wealth that rivaled the royal families of the continent. She never married. She never sought out another monarch or nobleman to elevate her status. She had learned the hardest, most brutal lesson the world had to offer. Power, granted by the grace of another, can be snatched away on a whim, but power forged by one's own bloody, calloused hands belongs to you forever. Evelyn's historical karma was the absolute triumph of the discarded. She proved, with every gold coin she minted and every life she saved, that a poor foundation does not guarantee a fatal fall, not if you have the relentless, unyielding grit to rebuild the floor beneath you. Centuries drifted over the continent like heavy, obscuring snow. The kingdom of Ethelgard, once a fortress of iron and terror, was slowly dismantled by time, its towering spires collapsing into moss-draped ruins, its bloody history smoothed over by the relentless march of the ages. The terrifying legend of the Lycan King devolved into a mere parlor tale, a gothic bedtime story whispered by nurses to frighten disobedient children into behaving. Academic circles of the 18th and 19th centuries dismissed the tragedy of the monstrous king and the banished scullery maid as a wildly romanticized myth of the Dark Ages, an allegory for the harsh winters, nothing more. That absolute certainty remained unchallenged until the bitter, unforgiving winter of 1912. The dawn of the 20th century was an era obsessed with empirical truth, a time when science sought to drag the ghosts of the past into the harsh light of the laboratory. It was during this period that a massive archaeological expedition, funded by the Royal Historical Society and led by the fiercely meticulous Professor Thomas Arbuthnot, arrived on the desolate moors that once marked the southern border of Ethelgard. Arbuthnot was not looking for fairy tales. His mandate was to excavate a series of suspected mass graves linked to the devastating peasant rebellions of the late 15th century, seeking to document the agrarian collapse of the region. The conditions were remarkably similar to the legends. The ground was frozen solid, requiring the use of heavy iron pickaxes to break through the permafrost. For weeks, the excavation yielded nothing but the expected: shattered farm implements, rusted arrowheads, and the tragic, jumbled remains of fallen rebels. But on the morning of December 14th, in an isolated, sunken ditch far removed from the communal graves, a junior digger struck something anomalous. It was not a royal marble tomb. It was not a crypt lined with gold or protected by stone gargoyles. It was a shallow, muddy trench, submerged for centuries beneath an anaerobic peat bog. The unique, oxygen-deprived environment of the bog had acted as a miraculous, natural preservative. When Professor Arbuthnot and his chief forensic pathologist, Dr. Arthur Pendleton, carefully cleared away the dense black peat, they did not uncover a nameless peasant. They uncovered a spectacularly well-preserved skeleton that would completely rewrite the history books and anchor the fantastical legend of the Lycan King firmly into a shocking, documented reality. The skeletal remains told a gruesome, unmistakable story, one that Dr. Pendleton meticulously documented in medical journals that would later stun the global academic community. The skull of the deceased exhibited severe, terrifying deformities. The bone structure around the gums had drastically receded, pushing the canine teeth forward to create the distinct, horrifying illusion of fangs. Furthermore, the bones themselves were brittle, showing signs of severe vitamin D deficiency and advanced osteoporosis, indicative of a man who had spent the final, agonizing years of his life completely starved of sunlight, hiding in the darkest, dampest corners of the earth. This was not a magical curse. The forensic pathology definitively proved that the so-called monster was a human being suffering from the end stages of severe, untreated porphyria, combined with clinical lycanthropy, a psychological delusion where the sufferer genuinely believes they are transforming into an animal. The bones bore the horrific markers of a man who had gone completely, irrevocably feral. But it was the evidence of his final moments that brought a chilling silence to the excavation camp. The skeleton showed no signs of a glorious death in battle. There were no sword wounds, no crushed ribs from a heavy mace. Instead, the bones told a story of profound, agonizing destitution. The forensic markers indicated severe, prolonged malnutrition. The man had literally starved to death, his body consuming its own muscle and marrow to survive the freezing temperatures. The dreaded Lycan King, the monarch who had once commanded vast armies and dined on roasted fowl served on silver platters, had died crawling in the freezing mud, a nameless, despised beggar. Yet, the bones alone were not what shattered the skepticism of the modern world. It was what the skeleton was clutching. Preserved flawlessly in the dark, acidic mud of the bog, the skeletal fingers of the right hand were curled tightly, almost desperately, around a small, decaying object. When Dr. Pendleton transported the remains to the field laboratory and carefully applied chemical solvents to brush away the centuries of hardened dirt, the entire team stood in breathless, stunned silence. They did not find a royal signet ring. They did not find a jeweled cross, an amulet, or a piece of a shattered crown. The terrifying Lycan King, the man who had bathed his claws in the blood of traitors, the man who had sold his soul to maintain an illusion of absolute power, had died alone in a freezing ditch, clutching a single, frayed, intricately knotted piece of cheap leather shoelace. The discovery sent monumental shockwaves through the historical and archaeological communities. It was the undeniable, physical proof of the legend, dragging it from the realm of fantasy into the harsh, tragic light of human history. Darian had spent his final years wandering as an outcast, stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his sanity, completely broken by the inescapable consequences of his own cowardice. In his deepest, darkest despair, when the velvet doublets had rotted away and the false loyalty of his noble court had vanished into the wind, the only thing he clung to was the physical memory of the single act of genuine, unselfish humanity he had ever performed. The shoelace was his penance. It was a daily, haunting, physical manifestation of the pure, innocent love he had thrown into the fire simply to save his own pride. He died holding the very thing that proved he was once capable of being a man rather than a monster. Conversely, the historical footprint left behind by Evelyn was a breathtaking testament to the power of resilience. The discovery of Darian's grave triggered a massive, renewed interest in the economic archives of the Baltic region. A dedicated archival historian named Dr. Margaret Hastings traveled to the sprawling, meticulously maintained underground vaults of Lübeck, seeking the other half of the legend. Deep within the ledgers of the merchant guilds, beneath layers of dust and forgotten commerce, Dr. Hastings discovered the staggering truth. She found the last will and testament of the woman known in the trade logs as Evelyn, the Northern Healer. Evelyn had not just survived the frost wastes. She had conquered the era. The ledgers revealed an empire of immense wealth, built not on taxation or the blood of conquered lands, but on medical innovation and shrewd, unforgiving trade negotiations. She had patented tinctures, financed fleets, and commanded the respect of the most powerful maritime lords of the age. But her final will, a beautifully preserved document written on heavy vellum, was what truly illuminated the vast, cosmic difference between the king and the scullery maid. Her will did not speak of curses or vengeance against the kingdom that had wronged her. It did not contain the bitter ramblings of a scorned lover. Instead, it was a masterclass in calculated, enduring philanthropy. Evelyn dictated that the entirety of her vast, unimaginable fortune be placed into an irrevocable trust, used exclusively to establish a network of free hospitals, orphanages, and warming shelters across the entire Baltic coast. Her stipulations were incredibly specific, carrying the heavy, unmistakable weight of her own past traumas. The final paragraph of her testament read, "Let these halls be built of sturdy stone, and let the hearths remain eternally lit. I decree that no man, woman, or child shall ever be turned away into the cold night, regardless of the poverty of their birth, the emptiness of their pockets, or the fraying of their shoes. We are measured not by the crowns we wear, but by the foundations we build for those who stumble." The story of the Lycan King and his scullery maid is not a mere fairy tale of monstrous romance or supernatural betrayal. It stands today as one of the most profound, historically grounded, and scientifically verified lessons in the absolute terrifying mechanics of karma. Karma, as demonstrated by the dirt of Ethelgard and the archives of Lübeck, is not a mystical force that strikes from the heavens. It is the architectural result of our own choices. King Darian chose the illusion of power over the reality of love. He believed that brutality was strength and that vulnerability was a fatal flaw. In doing so, he engineered his own destruction, alienating everyone until he became the very monster he pretended to be, dying with nothing but freezing mud and a desperate grip on a leather string. Evelyn was stripped of everything. She was thrown to the literal and metaphorical wolves of winter, subjected to a betrayal that would have shattered the minds of most. And yet, she chose to weaponize her pain. She chose resilience over despair and intellect over vengeance. She built a legacy of life, healing, and unyielding strength that completely outlasted the stone walls of the kingdom that had banished her. In the end, the history books were forced to recognize the ultimate, ironic truth. The true beast of the 15th century was not the man suffering from a degenerative disease of the blood. The beast was the cowardice and the vanity that lived deep within his heart. And the true, enduring royalty of the era was never the man sitting upon a throne of melted swords. It was the lowly maid who stumbled on a frozen cobblestone, fell to her knees, and then rose up to conquer the world. Conclusion. The story of the Lycan King reminds us that true power isn't found in fear, but in the humanity we choose to uphold. Karma never forgets, and the historical echoes of Darian and Evelyn prove that betrayal carries a devastating debt. If this journey through history, romance, and dark karma captivated you, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow history buffs, and subscribe to the channel for more untold legends brought to life. See you next time!